If you're watching this video, then chances are you've seen my Gunvolt franchise retrospective, considering that thing's essentially hard carrying my channel at the moment. If not, then I recommend doing so, as this video is essentially a follow-up to that one. Ever since finishing my Gunvolt retrospective, I have eagerly been awaiting the release of Gunvolt 3, actively avoiding any promotional material in the hopes of being able to go in as blind as possible. And then I got my hands on Xenoblade 3 early, thanks to retailers, and pretty much completely forgot that this game was even slated for release that week. A friend hit me up and told me, hey, the game came out, and my initial reaction was just, okay, that happened I guess. And then I just kept playing Xenoblade. But after finally beating XP3, I finally got my hands on Gunvolt 3, and truth be told, I was excited. After the last 3 non-mighty entries were all excellent, hopes were high, and then I actually played the game. I ended up beating the game in only a single sitting on stream, getting both the bad and the true ending, and was left with only a single word to describe the game with: chaotic. Let's start with the changes that I generally liked. For one, I enjoyed the focus on a more melee-oriented character, and the general speed of the game was really nice. I also really liked the idea of the arc chain, as it in theory allows you to get through stages with some insane maneuvers. The music was also, as expected, pretty good, and I really liked how the instruments used in the tracks changed depending on the character you're currently playing. And that's about all the nice things I have to say about this game. Look, I feel the need to clarify that I'm not gonna be shitting on this game for the sake of being a contrarian or condescending or whatever dumb shit my comments call me. If you like this game, then that's awesome and you're totally entitled to your own opinion. Let's get into games' issues. Personally, the first thing I noticed when booting up the game was how even the title screen was a step back from either of the Luminous Avengers games. Whereas those had small animations playing in the background with the UI popping out in front in a stylish manner, this game just feels so lifeless. The font especially took me off guard. It's reusing the same one as Gunvolt 1 and 2, and it's just not nearly as clean or nice to look at as the simpler one from the Likes games. Whilst we're on the subject, let's talk about the mid-stage dialogue. The Copen games had that shit perfectly figured out. It was big enough to be read while playing, but never got in the way like in 1 or 2. 3, however, goes back to how the first 2 games did it, and it's frankly far more irritating here than it ever has been in the older games. I cannot tell you how many times I ended up quite literally shooting in the dark, because for the life of me I couldn't see the boss. Now there are options to either turn mid-stage dialogue off entirely, or lower their opacity, but neither of those really fix the problem, as you'll either be left missing out on the dialogue entirely, or reading it will be made way harder. To be fair, they did add an English dub like in Likes 2, which you could use to listen to the dialogue as you focus on playing. Unfortunately, it has a teensy tiny problem, being that the dub is fucking atrocious. You might not care, but I do. And since I'm a god of transitions, this also leads me over to my next point: the story. What the ever-loving fuck is up with the story? In many ways, it feels like it was an afterthought meant to feel the cool set pieces rather than be an actually good story, and you know what, that's fair. If you ask me, Gunvolt has never had particularly great stories, always being serviceable at best and forgettable but inoffensive at the worst, while having Copen as the only good character. This game though is a fucking mess. The plot is unnecessarily difficult to follow, the cast is annoying, by the end of it I just felt like my brain had been put through a meat grinder. The issue isn't even that the plot is complex or anything, but there's just so much happening all at once and the explanations are so sporadic that it sometimes becomes too much. 1 second GV is a giant dragon, the next he's a Pokemon, and then he's a man again. 1 minute I'm rushing through a stage while getting a seizure, and the next Joshua from middle school is standing in front of me, despite me having killed him 45 years ago at his little brother's bar mitzvah, and the fight's already over. When you sit down and take your time with the game, that is, taking the story at a much slower pace, then you'll find it to be just as simple and easy to follow as any other game. Play it normally, however, and it gets buried under quite literally everything else. It's a complete sensory overload. On the gameplay side of things, the same issues unfortunately persist. Before I talk about the characters, let me go over some of the changes that affect the game as a whole, because believe me, there are a lot of them. For one, the way Kudos, Anthem and the like work have been completely reworked. You don't actually lose Kudos anymore. Instead, using Pervasion or taking damage puts a little lock over them. And to continue adding to your score, you'll first have to break the seal by gaining a specified amount of Kudos. Now I really couldn't care less, but if the comments on my other Gunvolt video have taught me anything, it's that people really love going for high scores in these games. And this change kinda trivializes that. as it makes getting kudos far more forgiving. As a consequence of this, entering the Awakened mode at 1000 kudos is now significantly easier. So to counteract that, the Awakened state is now on a time limit, with every 1000 kudos you get afterward getting you into it once more. One small issue, it still plays idle music, and because of how easy it is to achieve the Awakened state, you're going to be hearing it a lot, depending on how you play, maybe even more than the regular stage themes, which are just way better tracks in general. If you like idle music, then that's fucking fine. I'll still be judging you, but I'll be doing so silently. God, on the other hand, I'm not so sure. Either way, I really wish there was an option to turn off Lumen's songs entirely, since the likelihood of you hearing them is so much higher than the other games. There's also this new mechanic that allows some bosses to be revived Anthem style. They'll have much less health than in the fight proper, and when this happens you end up getting one bonus image pulse after beating a stage. And here's where the two main issues with this mechanic come into play. Firstly, it adds an element of RNG that seriously didn't need to exist. These games are pretty good when it comes to being able to speedrun them, and this mechanic can genuinely make or break some of the times for a lot of the game's stages. Secondly, when this mechanic is activated, you receive an additional image pulse after beating a level, as I mentioned earlier. What are image pulses, you ask? Fuck you for asking. They suck. They're essentially what replaces the equipment and the skills from the first two games, being yet another thing that both Luminous Avengers games had already figured out how to do to a much better extent. Within every stage you can find some more or less hidden collectibles called image chips, and at the end they get thrown into a shitty gacha system that turns them into a random image pulse, of which there's 3 types. The first type can be equipped passively, and they do stuff like increase your kudo gain, or boost your EXP and whatnot. The second type can be equipped like the bonus skills in the first two games, letting you use them mid-stage while having a cooldown on their use. And the third just lets you select what music plays when you enter Awakened mode. Frankly, I never even got the music type because I kept getting fucking repeats. And that about does it for the general changes. Let's talk about the characters themselves. Most of your time will be spent playing as Kirin, whilst Gunvolt chills around sniffing his own ass or whatever the fuck Pokemon do. So let's talk about her first. Being melee oriented rather than ranged makes her the most distinct character in the series, even when compared to someone like Light's 2 Copen. While she does have a ranged attack, it's not used to actually damage enemies, instead being used to tag them, increasing the damage they take from your pre-hit melee combo. You can also teleport directly to an enemy, automatically damaging them in the process with the arc chain. You can even tag multiple enemies at once, allowing you to speed through the enemies really quickly. My only real issue with it is how unintuitive the control scheme is. This may just be a me issue, and if so then shame on me, but I for the life of me couldn't get used to her playstyle. Something about slashing with the R button just messes with my brain. Something I do really like about her though, is how every boss you beat grants you a permanent upgrade to your moveset, like being able to charge your talismans or spin slash while falling. Play well enough and the fetus gauge at the top of the screen will start to fill. Once it reaches 100% or higher, you'll be able to temporarily swap to Gunvolt, who frankly is little more than a glorified win button. GV has infinite jumps and infinite dashes. Flash Field is permanently active, and pressing the button that in every other game would activate the Flash Field causes every single enemy within a 10-meter radius to have a fucking seizure. He can also dash into enemies to suplex them, which is pretty much guaranteed to insta-kill just about every enemy in the game. He doesn't even take any damage, instead just slowly depleting the feathers gauge when hit. It is impossible to lose when playing as GV, and because of how easy it is to fill up the feathers, you can use him quite often and the game becomes an utter joke. Even more so than prior entries. His only drawback is that you get less kudos as him, and using special moves like Luxcalibur immediately drains your feathers, forcing you back to Kirin. But kudos are so easy to get in this game that it doesn't even matter, and his damage output is so insane as is, that using special moves is completely unnecessary. In fact, in my entire playthrough I never died a single fucking time. I had to die on purpose to even see how Anthem works in this game. Essentially, you're immediately switched over to Gunvolt, who enters his Super Awakened mode, which makes him fucking float, essentially allowing you to bypass entire sections of a stage until you reach the next hexapede, as there's no time limit on this mode. Whilst in this awakened state, Gunvolt can also just spam every single one of his special moves mid-movement, making even the hardest passages completely trivial. However, I will give them one thing: using this mode for too long or taking too much damage causes GV to go berserk, forcefully transforming him into his dragon form and booting you back to the title screen, serving as a sort of game over. It reminds me a lot of what happens when you reach the 100% on the D counter in Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter, which is fucking awesome and you should definitely play it, so I'd like to think this is a reference to that. I remember reading in an interview once that the developers talked about how people online kept thinking Copen was stronger than GV, and that him being so busted and free is supposed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that that isn't the case. And you know what? You proved your point, but at what cost? the team was faced with the absolutely Herculean task of following up on Gunvolt 2, which seems to have weighed a lot on the team during development, and I frankly don't blame them for trying to avoid doing that altogether, instead opting for a game that's completely different from everything that came before. Unfortunately, that resulted in a messy experience that feels like it's both being too much and too little. And considering that it costs around $40 depending on where you live, that's just... no, why? Sure, there are hard and very hard modes, but in the end there's just not enough content to warrant the price tag, when the second game offered quite a bit more of higher quality at that. It's a shame that the game ended up the way it did, but hey, that's life. And with all of that, do me a favor here and have a wonderful morning, day, or night. Cheers.